The small-town KFC was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. Its red and white checkered walls and flickering neon sign outside had been a staple of the town for as long as anyone could remember. Most of the time, the staff shuffled through their shifts without much to show for it beyond the greasy smell that clung to their clothes and a few dollars in tips. For Jake, it had become a prison. Jake was 22 and already burned out on the monotony. He'd spent the last 2 years slinging buckets of chicken and dishing out mashed potatoes to customers who barely noticed him. Every morning felt like a repeat of the one before. His shoes squeaked on the slick floors, his uniform was too tight, and his back ached from standing in place for hours on end. He had big dreams once, or at least he thought he did. But somewhere along the way, the fire inside him had gone out. Now, he just did what he had to do to get through each day. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day when the clock seemed to move slower than usual. The lunch rush had just died down, and the restaurant was quiet. A few stragglers sat at the booths, some families, others lonely individuals trying to avoid the reality outside those walls. Jake was behind the counter, wiping down the sticky surface of the register, when the door chimes announced a new customer. Jake barely looked up. "Hi, how can I help you?" he muttered, his voice flat, the way he always greeted customers who he didn't care about. The elderly man who walked in was dressed in an old, worn leather jacket and a baseball cap. His face was lined with age, his skin weathered but still strong, like it had withstood decades of storms. His eyes, though, were sharp, too sharp for Jake to ignore. The man shuffled up to the counter, his steps deliberate and slow. "Hey there, son," the man said with a gravelly voice. "Could I get the 2-piece with mashed potatoes and coleslaw?" Jake nodded absent-mindedly, punching the order into the register. "Anything to drink?" "Water's fine," the man replied, his voice carrying a weight that seemed oddly out of place in a fast food joint. Jake handed him his receipt with a vague smile and moved to the back to get the order ready. He was already losing patience. It wasn't that he had anything against the guy, he didn't really care about anyone. It was just that he was tired. Tired of the same routine, tired of the small talk, tired of everything. But life didn't care about his tiredness. Life didn't give a damn about his broken dreams, his failed relationships, or the fact that he was stuck here behind this counter. As Jake assembled the meal, he felt the heat of the fryer burn the back of his neck. He grabbed the mashed potatoes and the coleslaw from the station and slid them onto the tray. When he turned to hand it over, he noticed the old man staring at him. The look wasn't one of curiosity. No, this man's gaze was sharp, as though he could see right through Jake. For some reason, that stare triggered something in Jake. His grip tightened on the tray, and his face flushed with irritation. Maybe it was the way the man stood there so calmly, as though the world had all the time in the world. Maybe it was the fact that Jake felt so small under the pressure of his own life. Whatever it was, it pushed Jake over the edge. "You got a problem, old man?" Jake snapped, his voice louder than usual. The words slipped out before he could stop them, a result of months of pent-up frustration. The elderly man blinked, taken aback. But then, he just stared back, as if not understanding why Jake had said such a thing. "Excuse me," the man asked, his voice calm but firm. "You're staring at me like I'm some kind of freak," Jake continued, his tone rising. "What, you think I'm gonna screw up your order or something?" The old man didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to care about the accusation. Instead, he simply raised his hand, as if to calm Jake down. "Look, I wasn't staring at you. I just wanted my food." "Well, if you don't like the service, maybe you should go somewhere else." Jake was practically yelling now. The restaurant was quiet, the few remaining customers turning their heads toward the commotion. But Jake couldn't stop himself. All the bitterness, all the anger, all the frustration that had been simmering under the surface for months came flooding out in one explosive outburst. The man stood still for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over the money for the meal, his movements deliberate, as though nothing had just transpired. Jake grabbed the money, shoving it into the register with a little too much force. He didn't care. He didn't care about anything. The man's presence only seemed to make it worse. He slid the tray over the counter, slamming it down in front of the man. "There," Jake muttered, stepping back. "Enjoy your meal." The man didn't say a word. He simply took the tray and turned to sit at one of the booths in the corner, his back straight as he walked away. Jake watched him go, a mix of anger and guilt swirling inside him. It felt good to finally snap, to let all that tension out. But as he watched the man take a seat, something about it didn't sit right. Maybe it was the fact that the man hadn't reacted the way Jake expected. Maybe it was the quiet resignation in his movements, as if he had been through worse than this. Jake shook his head, trying to push the thought aside. The man was just an old customer. Who cared? The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Jake's mind kept drifting back to the old man in the corner booth. He couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. But he didn't want to dwell on it. It wasn't like anything was going to change. Life would go on, just like it always did. The same shifts, the same orders, the same empty conversations. Nothing ever really changed. It wasn't until the end of his shift that things took a turn. Jake was just getting ready to clock out when the manager, Samantha, walked over with an odd look on her face. "Hey, Jake," she said, her voice slightly strained. "We need to have a quick talk." "Sure," Jake replied, his heart sinking. "What's up?" "I don't know if you noticed, but that guy you yelled at earlier?" "He's the new owner of the franchise," Samantha said, her eyes wide. "He's Clint Eastwood." Jake blinked, unsure of what he was hearing. Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? The actor? "No way," Jake said, shaking his head. "I just yelled at Clint Eastwood." Samantha gave him a look that made it clear she wasn't joking. Jake's stomach dropped. He'd just yelled at Clint Eastwood. And he didn't even know it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake couldn't remember the last time he felt truly excited about something. He'd grown up in a quiet town, surrounded by familiar faces, where the idea of escaping seemed like a distant fantasy. The biggest thrill of his childhood had been sneaking out to the woods behind his house with his best friend, Ryan, to smoke cigarettes and talk about what life would be like when they finally left this place. But somehow, Ryan had managed to make it out, heading to college on a sports scholarship. Jake had stayed behind, settling into the rhythm of a life he didn't exactly choose but didn't know how to escape either. It wasn't that Jake didn't have potential. He was smart enough. He was witty. He could charm a crowd when he wanted to. But somewhere along the way, he stopped trying. High school had been a series of half-hearted attempts, half-hearted studying, half-hearted friendships, and, in the end, a half-hearted graduation. The town didn't offer much for someone like him. So, he took the first job he could get after graduation, working at KFC, where he figured the hours were steady, and the pay was just enough to keep the bills paid. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. But it was safe. Jake often thought back to his time at high school, remembering the dreams he once had. He wanted to go to college, maybe study something in business, maybe even start his own company. But reality had a way of knocking those dreams down, one by one. His mom had gotten sick when he was in his senior year. Bills piled up. His dad had left when Jake was barely old enough to understand it, leaving his mom to pick up the pieces. Jake tried to help her as best as he could, but it felt like nothing was ever enough. By the time he graduated, the weight of everything had settled on his shoulders like an anchor. He couldn't leave home for college when his mom needed him. But she wouldn't let him stay, either. Go, she'd said, her voice weak with the exhaustion of the illness that had taken over her body. You have to live your life, Jake. Don't throw it away for me. He had stayed. And he hated himself for it. Years later, Jake found himself standing in the same spot every day, behind that counter, surrounded by greasy fryers and trays of mashed potatoes, taking orders from people who barely looked him in the eye. He wasn't proud of it, but it was easier than facing what he felt was a lost future. He didn't know what he was supposed to do anymore, and that frustration burned inside him, making each day at KFC feel like a punishment. The customers weren't much better. Some of them were kind, the occasional older woman who would ask him how his day was going, but most were just like the rest of him, distracted, annoyed, rushing through their meal so they could get back to their real lives. The ones who didn't seem in a hurry, like that old man Clint Eastwood, were the hardest to deal with. They sat there with their quiet eyes, reminding him of everything he hadn't done, everything he'd missed out on. He couldn't stand it. But it wasn't all bad. There was Samantha, the manager, who had become the closest thing to a friend Jake had in that place. She was tough, but fair, and always had a sarcastic remark to lighten the mood. Jake could tell she cared about her job, even if she didn't show it much, and she had a way of making him feel like he wasn't entirely invisible. Then there was Maggie, a fellow worker who was always gossiping about her latest dating disaster, but who also kept him grounded with her upbeat attitude. Maggie was one of the few people at KFC who still saw him as a person, not just another face behind the counter. But beyond the surface of their interactions, Jake felt disconnected. He spent his days running on autopilot, trying to push through the endless hours, his mind wandering to places he didn't want to go. Even his coworkers, people he saw every single day, felt like strangers. When the doors of KFC closed at the end of the night, Jake found himself standing alone in the parking lot, staring at the flickering streetlight overhead. The weight of the world always seemed a little heavier at night. It was a lonely feeling, knowing that tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ring of his phone. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a message from Ryan, his old friend. Hey man, it's been a while. I'm coming into town for a few days. You free to hang out? Jake stared at the message, his finger hovering over the keyboard. He hadn't seen Ryan in almost 2 years, not since he'd left for college. They'd stayed in touch here and there, but life had moved on. Ryan had graduated, found a job in New York, and started a life that Jake could barely fathom. He had everything Jake wanted, a career, excitement, ambition. Jake, on the other hand, was still stuck in this place. It wasn't that he didn't want to hang out with Ryan. He just didn't know what to say. They were different people now. The gap between them had grown, even if neither of them ever acknowledged it. Ryan had everything he had ever wanted, while Jake had a job at KFC. Still, there was a part of him that wanted to reconnect, to find out if he could still talk to Ryan the way they used to. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to get out of this rut. Maybe talking to Ryan would help him see a way forward. Or maybe it would only remind him of how much he'd failed. Jake quickly typed a response. Yeah, man. Let me know when you're here. The next few days went by in a blur. The workday dragged on, and the tension in the restaurant seemed to intensify. Jake's outburst at Clint Eastwood haunted him, gnawing at the back of his mind. He hadn't meant to snap like that, but it had just happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clint's calm demeanor had somehow made everything worse, as if the old man had seen something in him, some hidden truth he wasn't ready to face. By the time Ryan arrived in town, Jake wasn't sure what to expect. He hadn't seen his friend in so long, but he could still remember the carefree days of high school, when it felt like they could conquer anything. Maybe they could reconnect, maybe not. But for the first time in a long while, Jake was ready to face something different. It was a Thursday evening when Ryan texted him that he'd arrived. Jake met him at a local bar, one of the few places in town where people still gathered to talk about their lives. Ryan was already there when Jake walked in, leaning against the bar, a smile lighting up his face when he saw Jake. "Man, it's been too long," Ryan said, pulling him into a hug. "You look good. You doing all right?" Jake couldn't help but smile, even if it felt like a mask. "Yeah, man. I'm good. Same old, you know." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Same old? Come on, man, what's really going on?" Jake took a deep breath, trying to find the words. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. The conversation flowed easily, like it always had. They laughed about old memories, joked about things that seemed so distant now. But as the night wore on, Jake realized how much he'd changed. Ryan still had that spark, that drive, the kind of enthusiasm Jake had once had. And for the first time in a while, Jake felt a flicker of something inside him, the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could still find his way out of this. But it wasn't until Ryan asked, "So what's next for you, man," that the weight of it all hit him. Jake shrugged, trying to act casual. "I don't know, man. Maybe something will change. I'm just stuck for now." Ryan nodded, studying him for a long moment. "Well, don't stay stuck forever. You've got potential, man. Don't waste it." The next morning, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of something hanging over him, an invisible thread tugging at his chest, pulling him in a direction he wasn't sure he was ready to go. He woke up late, groggy from the beer he'd shared with Ryan the night before. The conversation had been great, fun, even, but it had also left Jake with more questions than answers. What was he really doing with his life? Was this the best it was going to get? Was this all there was? He walked into the KFC, still trying to shake off the last remnants of his self-doubt. As soon as he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of fried chicken hit him, and the dull hum of the fryers and soda machines filled the air. Samantha was already behind the counter, looking just as tired as Jake felt. "Hey, Jake," she greeted him, her voice light. "You get some sleep, or were you up all night talking about old times with Ryan?" Jake chuckled half-heartedly, dragging his feet to the locker room. "Yeah, a little of both. You know how it goes." It was a quiet morning, with only a handful of customers trickling in. The lunch rush was still a couple of hours away, and the slow pace gave Jake time to clear his head. But despite the calm, something kept gnawing at him. Something about the night before was eating at him, and it wasn't just Ryan's words. It wasn't just his frustration with his job. No, it was the old man. Clint Eastwood. The thought of Clint Eastwood kept popping into Jake's mind, his calm demeanor, the look in his eyes when Jake had snapped at him, and the eerie realization that the man was somehow connected to the very franchise that Jake was stuck working for. He couldn't get past it. It was as if he had unwittingly stepped into a different world, a world where he was no longer in control. Everything had felt normal until that moment, until Clint had walked in, and everything shifted. He had no idea that Clint was the new owner of the franchise, of course. When he'd yelled at the old man, he hadn't known that the person standing across from him was a legend. If he had, would he have acted the same way? Probably not, but in a way, Jake was almost glad he hadn't known. It made the encounter all the more raw, all the more real. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could face whatever came next. At the thought of facing Clint again, Jake felt his chest tighten. He wasn't sure how to handle the situation. What would Clint even want from him? Would he fire him? Would he take his frustrations out on Jake? Or worse, would he ignore it completely and let it fester, holding it over Jake's head? The shift was dragging on, but it wasn't until around noon that the phone rang, breaking the silence. Samantha answered it, and Jake couldn't help but overhear her side of the conversation. "Yeah, sure, he's here." "Hold on a second," Samantha said before placing the phone down and looking up at Jake. Her eyes were wide, and there was an odd tension in the air. "Jake, "You're gonna want to take this call," Samantha said, nodding toward the phone. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" he asked, a little wary. She hesitated before responding, her tone quieter now. "It's Clint Eastwood. He wants to talk to you." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The realization hit him like a freight train. Clint was calling him. He wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a terrible one. Slowly, Jake walked over to the phone. His hands felt clammy, his mind racing as he picked it up. "Hello?" he said, his voice more nervous than he intended. "Jake," Clint Eastwood's voice came through the receiver, calm and steady. "I hope you're doing well today." Jake didn't know how to respond. He wanted to say something clever, something that would diffuse the tension, but his tongue felt thick in his mouth. Instead, he muttered, yeah, I'm good. How about you?" Clint chuckled, and Jake could hear the faint hint of a smile in his voice. "I'm doing well, thanks for asking. Listen, I wanted to have a word with you about yesterday." Jake's stomach sank. He had been expecting this. Clint was going to rip him apart, or worse, he was going to pretend it never happened, which would only make Jake feel more uncomfortable. "I know you didn't mean to lash out at me, Jake," Clint continued, his tone unwavering. "But I think there's something you need to understand." Jake clenched his jaw. Was Clint going to lecture him? Was he about to be made to feel like a fool for his outburst? Jake wasn't sure how much more humiliation he could take. "I want to give you a chance to make things right," Clint said, and for the first time, Jake could hear a slight edge of seriousness in his voice. "I'm the new owner of this franchise, and I'm not in the business of firing people over misunderstandings. But I also believe in respect, Jake. And what you did yesterday, it wasn't just a little mistake. You need to think about how you treat others, especially when you don't know who they are." The words stung more than Jake expected. He wasn't some kid anymore. He was an adult, and he should know better. But hearing it from Clint, hearing it from someone who had spent a lifetime in the spotlight, who had built an empire, made it feel different. It wasn't just some manager trying to correct a mistake. It felt like something bigger. Jake swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I shouldn't have said that to you. I got carried away." Clint paused for a moment, as if weighing Jake's sincerity. "I know you didn't, Jake. That's why I'm giving you a chance. But let me make this clear, this isn't just about one mistake. It's about a pattern. I've seen people who are stuck, people who think they have nothing left to give. I can't stand by and let that happen here." Jake's mind raced. Was Clint Eastwood really offering him a chance? Was this his shot at something different? Or was Clint just trying to teach him a lesson and move on? "I can offer you a chance to be better," Clint continued, his voice gentle but firm. "But only if you're willing to change. Only if you're willing to step up and take responsibility for the choices you make, both here and in your life." Jake's heart was pounding now. The words Clint had said echoed in his mind, reverberating with truth. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like someone believed in him. "I'll do better," Jake said, his voice more determined now. "I won't let you down. I'll show you I can change." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, Jake wasn't sure if Clint had heard him. But then Clint's voice came through again, this time softer, almost approving. "Good. I'm looking forward to seeing it. Let's just hope that next time, you think twice before you yell at the wrong person." As Jake hung up the phone, the weight on his chest felt lighter. He didn't know what this meant yet, but something was shifting. It wasn't just about KFC. It was about his life. Maybe Clint Eastwood, the last person he'd ever expected to talk to, had just given him the wake-up call he needed. But now he had to follow through. There were changes ahead, and it was up to Jake to decide if he was ready to step up. And that was the first step. The days that followed Clint Eastwood's phone call were nothing short of strange. Jake couldn't deny that something had shifted inside him, but it was hard to put into words. The apology had been sincere, but the promise to do better, was that just lip service, or was he truly ready to turn his life around? It felt like an unexpected weight had been lifted, but also like a challenge had been set before him, one that he wasn't entirely sure he was equipped to face. Each day after the phone call, Jake found himself coming into work a little earlier, staying a little later. He didn't want to disappoint Clint or anyone else, for that matter. Even the smallest improvements, like remembering to smile at customers or making sure the orders were always accurate, felt like small victories in a war he hadn't realized he was fighting. Samantha noticed the change first. She was always observant, but she also had a way of seeing through the surface and getting to the heart of the matter. One morning, as Jake wiped down the counter, she leaned against the prep station and raised an eyebrow at him. "You're different," she said, crossing her arms and smirking. "What's going on?" Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should tell her about Clint Eastwood's phone call, about the moment he'd promised to change. But something about Samantha made him want to be honest. "I had a talk with Clint the other day," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I yelled at him. I didn't know who he was, and I guess I don't know. He gave me a chance to make things right." Samantha's eyes widened, and she straightened up, taking a step closer. "Wait, Clint? As in, the Clint Eastwood?" She laughed, clearly not believing him at first. But when Jake nodded, she raised her hands in mock surrender. "Okay, I'm not going to lie, I'm a little impressed. The guy must see something in you if he's willing to give you a second chance." Jake chuckled nervously. "I don't know if I believe it myself yet. I'm still figuring things out, I guess." Samantha tilted her head, her expression serious for a moment. "Hey, it's not easy, you know. People don't just change overnight. But if Clint believes in you, I guess you owe it to yourself to try." Jake couldn't argue with that. The pressure of Clint's words weighed heavily on him, but it also made him feel like he was finally at a crossroads in his life. The question that had been nagging him since the moment Clint called was no longer just about his job at KFC, it was about whether he was ready to embrace something bigger, something that had always seemed out of reach. He knew he had to do more than just show up for work every day, he had to show up for himself. It wasn't long before Jake began to see the fruits of his effort. One evening, as he worked the drive-through window, he overheard a conversation between two regular customers. "Did you notice Jake lately?" one woman asked, a hint of surprise in her voice. "He's been on point, like, really on top of things." Her friend nodded, clearly agreeing. "I know. It's kind of weird. He seems different, I guess. More focused." Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of pride at hearing those words. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him believe that maybe he could do more than just survive. Maybe, just maybe, he could actually start thriving. The recognition wasn't just in the little comments from customers, though. Samantha started giving him more responsibility, and trusting him with managing shifts and overseeing some of the newer staff. At first, Jake was hesitant, unsure of his ability to handle it. But as the days went by, he found himself growing more comfortable. He wasn't just working at KFC anymore, he was becoming part of something bigger. And, slowly, the weight on his shoulders started to feel a little lighter. One particularly busy afternoon, Clint showed up at the restaurant, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. Jake had just finished taking an order when he saw the familiar face in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a slight smirk on his lips. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Clint to show up in person, and now here he was, in the flesh. Clint's presence immediately commanded attention. The few remaining customers in the restaurant paused for a moment, recognizing him. For a split second, it felt as if the world had stopped moving, and all eyes were on Jake. Jake swallowed hard, trying to calm his nerves. He walked toward Clint, who was watching him with an almost amused expression. "Hey, Clint," Jake said, his voice slightly unsure, but he managed to keep it steady. "What's up?" Clint gave him a nod of approval. "I wanted to check in on you," he said, his tone casual, but there was an undeniable weight behind his words. "How's everything been going?" Jake felt a rush of gratitude, but he couldn't let himself get too comfortable. This was Clint Eastwood, after all. He couldn't afford to look like a fool now. "It's been good," Jake said, his confidence starting to grow. I'm actually starting to feel like I'm getting the hang of things." Clint's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I'm glad to hear it," he replied, his voice warm but firm. "But remember, Jake, the work never stops. It's not just about showing up, it's about pushing yourself to be better every single day. You've got potential. Don't let it slip away." Jake nodded, the weight of Clint's words settling in once more. "I won't let you down, Clint. I'm going to keep pushing." Clint clapped him on the shoulder. "I'm looking forward to seeing how you keep rising, Jake. Keep at it." As Clint left the restaurant, Jake stood still for a moment, watching him go. It was one of those moments where everything seemed to click into place. Clint wasn't just some wealthy businessman looking to expand his franchise. No, he was something more. He was a mentor, a reminder that the path to success was about more than just working hard. It was about pushing through the tough moments, the ones when everything felt like it was falling apart, and continuing to rise. Jake had never been one to believe in destiny, but right then, he couldn't help but feel like maybe, just maybe, this was his chance. He wasn't just a guy working at KFC anymore. He was Jake, someone who was finally learning what it meant to take responsibility, to strive for more, and to believe in the possibility of change. The next day, as Jake prepared for another shift, he could feel it, the beginning of something new, something bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. The days following Clint's visit were a blur of hard work and growing self-awareness. Jake was becoming more attuned to the rhythm of the restaurant, adjusting to his newfound responsibilities, but something deeper was stirring inside him. It wasn't just about his job anymore, it was about his whole life. The transformation Clint had sparked in him wasn't limited to just bettering his performance at work. It had started to affect the way he viewed the world, his place in it, and what he truly wanted for himself. Still, the challenge remained: could he really change? Could he keep up the momentum and not slip back into the apathy that had once consumed him? Or was this just another fleeting phase, another false hope? One Friday night, the restaurant was busier than usual. The usual din of the kitchen was punctuated by the constant beep of the fryers and the steady hum of the drink dispensers. The line at the counter seemed to stretch longer than ever, and Jake found himself hustling to keep up with orders. Samantha was behind the grill, her eyes narrowed in focus, while Ryan was working the register, trying to keep the customers happy as they waited. Jake was in the middle of serving a family at the counter when the door opened, and in walked Clint. He didn't make a grand entrance, he never did. He simply walked in with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to announce his presence. Jake didn't notice him immediately, but when he did, his heart skipped a beat. Clint's eyes met his across the room, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade into the background. It wasn't the usual casual visit. There was something different in Clint's gaze this time, something more serious, almost as if he were studying Jake's every move. Clint didn't approach immediately, instead watching Jake as he worked. It was an unnerving feeling, knowing that someone was observing every little detail of his performance. Jake could feel the weight of Clint's gaze on him, and it only pushed him to focus harder on his task. But it was also a reminder of the promise he'd made to himself, and to Clint, that he wouldn't let this opportunity slip through his fingers. The evening rush began to settle, and the line started to thin out. Clint made his way over to the counter, his footsteps quiet but deliberate. Jake was wiping down a table when Clint stood in front of him, looking him over as if assessing not just his work but the person standing before him. "Jake," Clint began, his voice low and steady, "How are you holding up?" Jake looked up, surprised by the question. He hadn't expected Clint to ask anything so personal. But in that moment, it felt like more than just a simple check-in. It felt like Clint was trying to gauge his growth, to see if the change he had hoped for was real. "I'm doing good," Jake said, his voice steadier than it had been when they first spoke. "I've been keeping busy, trying to keep on track. I'm starting to get the hang of things." Clint nodded slowly, clearly not satisfied with a simple answer. He studied Jake for a moment before speaking again, this time with a hint of concern in his voice. "Jake, that's good to hear. But I want you to think about something. I've been watching you for a while now, and I've seen the effort you're putting in. But I've also seen something else. You've got this fire in you, but sometimes it seems like you're holding back. Like you don't fully believe in yourself." Jake blinked, taken aback by Clint's words. He hadn't expected the conversation to go in this direction. He had thought Clint would just give him another pat on the back, another quick affirmation. But Clint was pushing him, digging deeper than he was prepared for. "I don't know what you mean," Jake replied, his words coming out almost defensively. Clint's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "Jake, I've been in your shoes before. I've been in places where I didn't think I was capable of more, where I let fear and doubt rule my decisions. But I'm telling you, you've got the potential to do so much more than you're giving yourself credit for." Jake felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't want to admit it, but Clint was right. There were times, so many times, when he held back, times when he doubted himself, convinced that he wasn't good enough to make a change, let alone succeed. "I've always just played it safe," Jake muttered, almost to himself. "I guess I didn't think I was cut out for more than this." Clint's eyes narrowed, and he took a small step forward, lowering his voice. "That's where you're wrong, Jake. You're capable of much more than just getting by. But to get there, you've got to be willing to face the fear, the doubt. You've got to trust that you can do it, even when it feels impossible." Jake swallowed hard, the weight of Clint's words sinking in. It wasn't just about work, or his responsibilities at KFC, it was about everything. His entire life had been a series of playing it safe decisions, from the friends he chose to the way he handled his relationships. He'd always chosen comfort, always chosen the familiar, even if it meant staying in a place where he wasn't truly happy. But now it felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Jake wasn't sure if he was ready to take that leap, but Clint was right. If he wanted something more, he had to change. He had to believe in himself, even when it was hard to see how it would all play out. "I don't know if I'm ready," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint's gaze softened, but there was still a fire in his eyes. "Jake, nobody's ever ready. You just have to take that first step. And when you do, you'll find that the rest starts to fall into place. I've seen it happen with so many people. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Jake looked at Clint, really looked at him, and for the first time, he understood what Clint had been trying to tell him all along. This wasn't just about work. This was about life. About taking responsibility for who he was and where he wanted to go. It was about trusting himself and taking a chance. "I'll do it," Jake said, his voice firmer now. "I'll take the step. I'm not going to hold back anymore." Clint's face broke into a rare smile, one that was more genuine than Jake had seen before. "That's what I like to hear, Jake. I'm proud of you." For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was on the edge of something incredible. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be moments of doubt along the way. But in that moment, he knew that the road ahead was his to choose. He had the power to shape his own future, and with Clint's words echoing in his mind, Jake took the first step towards something greater than he had ever imagined. And for the first time in his life, he felt ready. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind to Jake. He had made a promise to himself, and there was no turning back now. The change that Clint Eastwood had sparked in him was starting to feel more real with every passing day. But it wasn't just the work that was changing, Jake was starting to change. He was beginning to look at the world through a different lens, one that focused more on growth than survival. And while it wasn't always easy, it was becoming clear that this was just the beginning of something bigger. The restaurant was busy, as usual. The lunch rush had already begun, and Jake was moving faster than ever, juggling orders, coordinating with the kitchen, and helping customers with their needs. But even in the chaos, he found a new sense of clarity. His focus was sharper, his movements more deliberate. He was finally stepping into the role he'd been afraid to take on before, the role of someone who believed in their own potential. Samantha had noticed the difference. She wasn't the type to hand out compliments lightly, but recently, she'd been giving Jake a lot of praise. Not just for his work, but for the way he carried himself. The way he handled situations with a calm demeanor that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about getting everything right, it was about facing challenges head-on and refusing to back down. One evening, after the dinner rush had finally quieted down, Samantha pulled Jake aside as he was restocking napkins in the back room. "Hey, Jake," she said, her tone casual, but there was a hint of something more serious in her voice. "I just want to say, you're doing great. Like, really great." Jake looked up, slightly taken aback by her words. He wasn't used to hearing that kind of praise, especially from someone as tough as Samantha. "Thanks. I'm trying to do better." "No, it's more than that," Samantha insisted. "I can see it. You're not just doing better, you're actually leading. People are looking to you for guidance. They're listening to you." Jake swallowed, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't just the recognition that was catching him off guard, it was the fact that it came from someone like Samantha, someone who had been with the restaurant for longer than he had and who knew how to navigate every situation with ease. "I never thought I could be a leader," Jake said softly, his voice filled with a mix of humility and uncertainty. "But I'm starting to see that maybe I have more to offer than I thought." Samantha gave him a reassuring smile. "That's the thing, Jake. You have so much more inside of you than you realize. You just had to take the time to see it for yourself." Jake felt a knot form in his chest, a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. Samantha's words hit him harder than he expected. In all the years he'd spent trying to just get by, he hadn't given himself permission to see his own potential. And now, it was like a whole new world was opening up to him. But the weight of the change wasn't without its challenges. As the weeks passed, Jake found himself grappling with new internal battles. There were moments when he doubted himself, when the old patterns of self-doubt crept back in. He wasn't immune to the struggle, it wasn't like flipping a switch and suddenly becoming a different person. But each time the doubt reared its ugly head, Jake reminded himself of Clint's words. "Nobody's ever ready. You just have to take that first step." And so, Jake kept stepping. Every time he faced a challenge, every time something didn't go as planned, he faced it with a new resolve. The fear didn't disappear, but it no longer had the power to paralyze him. He learned to push through it, to use it as fuel instead of allowing it to stop him in his tracks. One evening, after another particularly tough shift, Clint appeared again. This time, he didn't just show up as a visitor, he came in to check on things. Jake saw him as he walked into the restaurant, looking calm and collected as always. But there was something different in the way Clint looked at him this time, something that made Jake's heart race with anticipation. Clint made his way toward the back office, where Jake was filling out some paperwork. When he entered, he didn't waste any time. "I've been watching you, Jake," Clint said, his voice steady but full of purpose. "You've been doing good work. Really good work." Jake looked up, surprised by Clint's sudden praise. He wasn't used to compliments, and he wasn't sure how to respond. "Thanks, Clint. I've been trying." Clint nodded, his eyes serious now. "I can see that. And that's why I want to give you something more." Jake furrowed his brow, confused. What do you mean? Clint leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. I want you to take on more responsibility. I want you to start thinking bigger than just running the shift here. I want you to start thinking about the bigger picture, about how we can make this restaurant the best in the city. Jake's eyes widened. The idea of taking on more responsibility was terrifying. He'd barely gotten comfortable in his current role, and now Clint was asking him to step into something even bigger. But then he remembered the promise he made. He remembered the fire Clint had seen in him, the potential he hadn't believed in before. And in that moment, Jake knew what he had to do. Okay, he said, his voice firm. I'm in. Clint's lips curled into a small smile. Good. I knew you had it in you. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, new strategies, and long hours. Jake was in charge of implementing changes to improve the flow of the restaurant, from training new employees to refining the customer experience. He faced setbacks, of course, but this time, they didn't knock him down. Each challenge only made him more determined. And then, one day, the restaurant hit a milestone, one they had never reached before. Sales were up, the customer satisfaction rate had improved, and the team was working better than ever. It wasn't just a success in terms of numbers, it was a success in terms of people. Jake had helped lead his team to something better, and in doing so, he had become someone he never thought he could be. As he stood in the restaurant that evening, watching the team finish up for the night, Jake felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just the work he had done, it was the person he had become. He had risen from the ashes of self-doubt, and in doing so, he had created a new reality for himself. And as Clint had said, it wasn't about being ready. It was about taking that first step, and then another, and another. Jake had taken those steps, and now, he was walking a road he never thought he would be on, a road toward something bigger than just a job. It was the road toward becoming the best version of himself. And for the first time in his life, Jake knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Jake had come a long way since Clint's first visit, and now, as he walked through the restaurant early one morning, he could hardly believe how much had changed. The familiar hum of the kitchen, the clatter of trays and dishes, the voices of his co-workers, it all felt different somehow, as though it had been transformed right alongside him. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft golden glow through the restaurant windows. Jake stood still for a moment, taking it all in. He had once felt like a small cog in a massive machine, unsure of his place, unsure if he could make a real difference. But now, he felt like part of something bigger. He was more than just a worker, he was part of the heartbeat of the place. It wasn't just the responsibilities Clint had given him that made him feel this way. It was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, Jake had found a sense of purpose. He had stepped up, not just for the restaurant, but for himself. The fear and doubt that had once held him back were still there, but they no longer controlled him. As the doors to the restaurant opened and his team began trickling in for the morning shift, Jake found himself feeling a deep sense of pride. They looked to him for guidance now, just as he had once looked up to Clint. And while the weight of the role was still new and sometimes overwhelming, Jake knew he was ready to carry it. But even as he stood there, a sense of unease crept over him. It wasn't fear this time, it was something else. Something that had been bubbling beneath the surface for weeks. Despite everything that had gone right, something about the restaurant still didn't feel complete. Clint had challenged Jake to think bigger, to aim higher, but what did that really mean? And more importantly, what did it mean for Jake's future? That evening, after the shift was over and the team had clocked out, Clint called Jake into the back office. Jake had noticed Clint's intensity had been growing over the past few weeks, and it seemed like tonight was no different. Clint had a way of getting straight to the point, and tonight, Jake had a feeling it wouldn't be any different. Jake, Clint said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of its own, we've made some great progress here. The team is solid, the customers are happy, and the numbers speak for themselves. But this is just the beginning. We've got bigger goals ahead. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had anticipated something like this. There was always a next step, a new challenge, and Clint didn't believe in resting on his laurels. What are you thinking? Jake asked, trying to steady his voice. Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. I want you to take on a bigger role. We're planning to open a few more locations in the area, and I want you to lead the charge. You've got the drive and the experience now, but I'm going to need you to step up even more. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Opening new locations. He had been feeling stretched thin as it was, and now Clint was asking him to manage multiple restaurants. He wasn't sure he was ready for something that big. I don't know, Jake said hesitantly, his doubts resurfacing. I'm still trying to figure out the rhythm here. There's a lot going on already. Clint's gaze remained steady, unwavering. I understand that. But the truth is, if you want to keep growing, you can't just stay in the comfort zone. You've got to push yourself further. I believe in you, Jake. You've shown me time and time again that you've got what it takes. Now it's time to prove it to yourself. Jake swallowed hard. The pressure was building, but deep down, he knew Clint was right. He couldn't afford to let his doubts hold him back. He had come so far, and this was the next logical step. But it still felt like a leap of faith, and a part of him was terrified. I'll do it, Jake said finally, his voice firmer than he felt. I'm in. Clint smiled, but it wasn't the same smile of casual approval from before. This was a smile that conveyed a deep sense of trust and respect. Good. I knew you would be. As Jake left the office that night, his mind was a whirlwind. Opening new locations, he had never imagined that would be his next step. But there was no turning back now. This was his opportunity, and he couldn't let fear stand in his way. The next few weeks were filled with meetings, planning sessions, and intense preparation. Clint had been right about one thing, Jake was ready for more. The leadership skills he had been developing weren't just about managing the restaurant, it was about managing people, making decisions, and thinking critically about the future. And as each day passed, Jake found himself growing into the role more and more. But with the new responsibilities came new challenges. The pressure mounted as Jake worked to open the new locations. The logistics, the hiring process, the budgeting, it was a lot to juggle. And with each new task, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of doubt creeping in. What if he wasn't as ready as Clint thought? What if he failed? One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Jake stood in the office, staring at the blueprint for the new restaurant. The plans looked perfect on paper, but the weight of the project was starting to feel overwhelming. Just as he was about to take a seat and bury his head in his hands, the door opened, and Clint walked in. Without a word, Clint sat down across from Jake, his expression unreadable. You look like you could use a break, Clint said, his voice low. Jake chuckled, a bit more nervously than he intended. I don't know how I'm going to pull this off. Clint studied him for a moment before speaking, his voice firm but calm. You've already pulled it off. You've already shown yourself, and everyone else, that you've got the heart and the determination to make this happen. The doubt you're feeling? That's just a sign that you're pushing yourself to grow. It means you're doing something right. Jake felt a tightness in his chest as Clint's words hit him. He had been afraid of failure, of falling short. But Clint was right, the fear he was feeling wasn't a signal to stop. It was a signal that he was on the verge of something bigger, something that could change everything. I just don't want to let anyone down, Jake admitted, his voice soft. Clint smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. You won't. As long as you keep moving forward, even when things get tough, you'll never let anyone down. And most importantly, you'll never let yourself down. Jake nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in the right place. He had come this far, and now it was time to keep going. There was no turning back now. He was ready for the challenge. And whatever came next, Jake knew he had the strength to face it. Jake's heart raced as he stood in front of the new restaurant, looking at the building that would soon house the next phase of his life. The grand opening was just days away, and despite all the planning and preparation, there was still a part of him that was unsure. He had spent weeks managing the logistics, from hiring new staff to working on marketing campaigns and finalizing the layout. Now, it was all coming down to this moment, the culmination of months of hard work. The sun was setting behind the building, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and for a brief moment, Jake felt the weight of it all. The future of this new location was in his hands. It wasn't just about keeping the business afloat or making sure the customers were happy, it was about creating something that could grow, something that could make an impact. Something that could change the lives of everyone involved, including his own. As he stood there, deep in thought, Clint pulled up beside him in his truck. Clint had been quiet lately, letting Jake take the lead on the day-to-day operations of the new location, but Jake knew he was still watching, still expecting great things. Clint had faith in him, and that faith was a constant reminder that Jake couldn't afford to let fear take over. "You ready for this, kid?" Clint asked, stepping out of the truck, his voice steady as always. But Jake could hear the underlying hint of excitement in his tone. Jake glanced at Clint, trying to mask the nervousness he felt. "I don't know. There's still a lot to do. The staff is new, and the systems aren't fully in place yet. It feels like there's always something I'm missing." Clint gave him a small, knowing smile. "That's the thing about this business, it never stops. There's always something. But that's also where the magic is. You just have to embrace the chaos." Jake let out a breath, nodding. "Yeah, I guess that's true. I keep telling myself it'll get easier once we open, but I know that's just the start of a whole new set of challenges." "You're right," Clint agreed, his tone turning serious. "The challenges will never stop. But that's the test, Jake. It's how you deal with them that matters. You've already proven you can handle the pressure. Now it's time to build something that lasts." Jake took a moment to absorb Clint's words. It was true, he had already faced a lot of challenges, from the pressure of running the first restaurant to dealing with the self-doubt that had always held him back. But he had made it through each one, and he was stronger because of it. The opening day came faster than Jake expected. The restaurant was packed from the moment they unlocked the doors. New staff were hustling to get the orders right, customers were filling the tables, and the kitchen was buzzing with activity. The energy was contagious, but so was the anxiety that seemed to hang in the air. Jake stood in the corner, watching everything unfold. He wasn't just overseeing the team, he was part of it. He worked side by side with the servers and cooks, jumping in whenever needed, ensuring that everything was running smoothly. He had learned from Clint that being a leader wasn't about sitting in an office and delegating, it was about being in the trenches with your team, showing them that you were willing to work just as hard as they were. But even as he moved through the chaos, Jake could feel the weight of the new responsibilities on his shoulders. It wasn't just the success of the restaurant that was at stake, it was his own growth. This was his chance to prove that he could handle more, that he was ready for the next step in his journey. As the night wore on, Jake couldn't help but notice the small victories. A customer gave a compliment on the food, a staff member came to him with a problem and walked away with a solution. The restaurant was still far from perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. And that, Jake realized, was what mattered. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. But despite the moments of success, there was still a voice in the back of his mind that doubted him. What if this location didn't succeed? What if he couldn't handle the pressure of managing multiple restaurants? Clint had given him the tools he needed to push forward, but the fear still lingered. It wasn't the kind of fear that would paralyze him anymore, but it was the kind of fear that reminded him how much was at stake. The next morning, after the excitement of the opening night had faded, Jake sat in the office, surrounded by paperwork and reports. He was already thinking ahead to the next step, how to expand, how to continue growing the business. He knew that the challenges wouldn't stop just because they had successfully opened the doors. The real work was just beginning. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was Samantha, who had been working at the new location since the beginning. "Got a minute?" she asked, stepping inside with a friendly smile. "Of course. What's up?" Jake replied, trying to push away the sense of overwhelm that had been creeping in. Samantha sat down across from him. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Jake raised an eyebrow, not sure what to expect. "What's going on?" "I've noticed how much things have changed since Clint handed you the reins here. I mean, you've always been good at what you do, but now, it's like you found your rhythm. I think the team is really starting to respect you more, too." Jake felt a small knot in his stomach, unsure of how to react to the praise. He had been so focused on the tasks at hand that he hadn't taken the time to consider how the team was viewing him. "You think so?" Jake asked, his voice a little unsure. "I do," Samantha said, leaning forward. "It's obvious that you care about the team and the restaurant. But there's something else I've noticed: you're starting to trust yourself more. And that's a huge part of what makes a good leader. You're not just telling us what to do, you're guiding us, helping us see the bigger picture." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. He hadn't realized how much his own growth had affected the team. It wasn't just about his ability to manage, it was about the confidence he exuded, the way he had learned to trust himself and his decisions. "I'm still figuring a lot of it out," Jake admitted. "But I'm starting to believe that maybe I'm capable of more than I thought." Samantha smiled, her eyes full of encouragement. "You've always been capable, Jake. It's just taken some time for you to see it. And now that you have, there's no stopping you." For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was on the right path. The journey wasn't going to be easy, he knew that. But he also knew he was no longer alone in it. He had a team that believed in him, and Clint's faith in him was unwavering. The road ahead would be full of obstacles, but Jake had finally come to terms with one simple truth: he was ready for whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he was no longer afraid to face it. Jake woke up with a sense of urgency that morning. It wasn't the excitement of the new restaurant anymore, it was the looming weight of the future. The momentum was there, and things were moving forward, but there were growing pains that he couldn't ignore. As he stood in front of the mirror, brushing his teeth and glancing at his reflection, he realized just how far he had come. But it didn't feel like enough. Not yet. He was about to face the first real test of his leadership. The kind of challenge that would make or break him. The phone call came in while Jake was at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee. It was Clint. "Hey, Jake, we need to talk." Clint's voice came through with its usual firmness, but there was something in his tone that made Jake's heart skip a beat. "Is everything okay?" Jake asked, immediately feeling a surge of tension. Clint was quiet for a moment. "We've hit a bit of a snag with one of the new locations. There's an issue with the lease, apparently, the landlord is pulling out. I need you to come in and help me sort this out. Fast." Jake's stomach dropped. He'd been aware that things could go wrong, every business faced setbacks, but this felt like something bigger. "Got it. I'll head over there right now," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. As he hung up, he realized that he couldn't handle this in the same way he had handled the day-to-day operations. This was a business decision, something much bigger than managing the staff or dealing with customer complaints. This was about securing the future of the restaurant chain, and Jake wasn't sure if he was ready to take on something that significant. He arrived at the restaurant office, where Clint was already waiting. His face was set, his jaw tight. This wasn't just a minor issue, it was serious. "What's going on?" Jake asked as he walked in, scanning Clint's face for any hint of what was really at stake. Clint sat down at the desk and motioned for Jake to take a seat across from him. "We're dealing with a serious problem. The landlord is backing out of the deal at the last minute. If we can't come to an agreement, we'll lose the lease, and that means we'll have to close this location." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. Losing this location would be a massive blow. It wasn't just about the money, it was about everything they had worked for, everything they had built. It could set them back months, maybe even longer. "What can we do?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the rising panic inside him. "We need to negotiate with the landlord, but they're not budging. They want a price increase that's far beyond what we're willing to pay. I've tried everything I can, but it's going to take someone with fresh ideas, someone who can think outside the box." Jake knew what Clint was implying. He needed to step up. He needed to be the one to figure this out. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked, his voice steady, but his mind was spinning. "I need you to go in and make them an offer they can't refuse," Clint said, his eyes locking onto Jake's with an intensity that made the pressure feel even heavier. "Use your instincts. We can't afford to lose this location. You've got to make them see the value of keeping us here." Jake nodded, even though doubts flooded his mind. This wasn't something he had ever done before. Negotiating with landlords, talking numbers, convincing someone to change their mind, this was a whole new territory. But if Clint believed in him, maybe he could do it. Maybe. By the time Jake arrived at the landlord's office, his nerves were on edge. He had read through the lease agreement multiple times on the way over, trying to find any loopholes or areas where they could push back. But everything seemed airtight. The only thing left was to convince the landlord to see things differently. He stepped into the landlord's office, a sleek, modern space with minimal decor. The landlord, a middle-aged man with a stern face and sharp eyes, motioned for Jake to sit down. "You must be the one Clint Eastwood sent to save the day," the landlord said, his voice clipped, almost mocking. Jake took a deep breath, trying to hold his ground. "I'm here to find a solution that works for both of us." The landlord raised an eyebrow. "Solution? The only solution I see is an increased rent. You want to stay here, you pay more. Simple as that." Jake kept his voice steady, though inside, his mind was racing. "I understand that, but this location has been a success. We've brought in steady traffic, and we're looking at expanding further. Raising the rent so drastically will hurt that expansion. It's not just about this location, it's about the long-term partnership we could have." The landlord leaned back in his chair, clearly not impressed. "I've heard all the arguments before. This is business, not charity." "I know," Jake replied, his voice firm now. "But let's consider the bigger picture. What we bring to the table isn't just customers, it's stability. We've been successful here, and I'm confident we can continue to grow. If you raise the rent, we'll have to reconsider our options. But if we can work something out, I promise you, you'll see even greater returns." There was a long silence. The landlord studied Jake, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. Jake couldn't tell if he was making any headway or just wasting his breath. Finally, the landlord spoke. "You're a smart kid. I'll give you that. But I still need to see something more, something that convinces me this will work in the long run." Jake's heart raced as he realized that this was the moment he needed to turn things around. "What if we offer a longer lease agreement, with a slight increase, but with a cap on how much it can rise over the next few years? We can offer a guarantee on our business, and you'll know we'll be here for the long haul." The landlord paused. The idea clearly intrigued him, but he didn't immediately commit. "I'll need to think about it. But you're not far off. I'll talk it over with my team, and we'll see if we can reach a compromise." Jake didn't want to leave the room without some kind of commitment, but he also knew he couldn't push too hard. He had made his case, and now it was up to the landlord to decide. "I appreciate your time," Jake said, standing up. "I'll be waiting for your response." As he walked out of the office, Jake felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. He wasn't sure if he had done enough, but he had given it his all. He had taken the first step toward securing the future of the restaurant, and now, it was in the landlord's hands. As he drove back to the restaurant, Jake reflected on what he had just done. This wasn't just a negotiation. It was a test. A test of his ability to navigate challenges and make tough decisions. And while he didn't have all the answers, he had learned something important that day. Leadership wasn't just about making the right decisions, it was about making the tough ones. The ones that stretched you, made you uncomfortable, and forced you to grow. He might not have been sure of the outcome, but for the first time in a long time, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Ready to face whatever came next. The next few days felt like a blur. Jake went about his usual routine at the restaurant, but the nagging thought of the lease negotiation never left his mind. Every phone call, every conversation with the staff, every quiet moment at the counter was colored by the looming uncertainty. The weight of the decision, the pressure of keeping this restaurant alive, and the knowledge that his fate and the company's future were on the line kept him on edge. It was an odd feeling, knowing that one decision could have the power to change everything. Yet, it wasn't just the restaurant's survival that hung in the balance. It was also his own growth. He had always played it safe, kept his distance from high-risk situations, and had never truly been forced to make such a difficult decision. Now, he was the one in charge, and the consequences were all his to bear. The call from the landlord came at 3 p.m. on a Friday. Jake was in the office going over the week's numbers when the phone rang. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the caller ID. "Hello." Jake answered, trying to steady his voice. "This is Peter James, the landlord," the voice on the other end said. "I've had a chance to review your offer. And I'm willing to work with you, but it's going to require a few adjustments." Jake's pulse quickened. This was it. "What kind of adjustments are we talking about?" he asked, leaning forward, hanging on to every word. "I'll agree to your proposed rent cap, but there's one condition," Peter said, his voice casual, yet firm. "I want a larger deposit up front. Something that shows you're serious about long-term stability." Jake's mind raced. The deposit was a substantial amount, one that could significantly affect the cash flow of the business in the short term. But he also knew that keeping this location open was vital for the future growth of the chain. Without it, they'd be losing not only the revenue but also the credibility that came with being present in such a prime location. "That's a lot of money," Jake said, his voice tight. "We don't have that kind of cash just lying around." "I understand that," Peter replied. "But if you want this lease, you'll need to show that you have the financial stability to back it up. The longer I wait, the less likely I am to keep the deal on the table. You need to decide fast." Jake's stomach churned. He could feel the gravity of the moment, the crossroads between securing their future and risking it all. He could hear Clint's voice echoing in his mind, "Trust yourself. Don't second-guess your instincts." "Give me a moment to talk it over," Jake said, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. As soon as he hung up the phone, he stood up and paced the small office. His mind swirled with options, but they all seemed to lead to the same place: a large deposit was the only way forward. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, someone else would take the space. The idea of losing this restaurant, after everything they had worked for, was a sinking feeling in his chest. Jake took a deep breath and picked up his phone. He dialed Clint's number, hoping for some clarity. "Jake, what's going on?" Clint answered quickly, the urgency in his voice clear. "The landlord agreed to the terms, but he wants a huge deposit up front." "It's a lot more than we can afford right now," Jake said, his voice filled with tension. "I don't know if we can swing it." Clint was silent for a moment, the only sound on the other end being the faint hum of traffic. "I know you're trying to do the right thing," Jake, but this is a test. You need to decide whether you're in or out. Jake's heart raced as Clint's words sank in. He had never thought of it this way, a test of his commitment, his belief in the business. Clint wasn't offering advice, he was challenging Jake to make the tough call on his own. You're right, Jake said, his voice firmer now. This is my decision. I've got to do it. Good, Clint replied. It's a big risk, but I know you can handle it. Make the call, and get back to me. We'll figure out the rest. The conversation ended, and Jake stood in silence for a moment, his hand still gripping the phone. He looked out the office window at the restaurant across the street, the one he had fought so hard to get. It was everything to him. Without wasting another second, Jake picked up the phone and dialed the landlord. I'll take the deal, Jake said when Peter answered. I'll get the deposit together. We'll make it happen. Peter was quiet for a moment before replying. I'll have the contract ready for you to sign by Monday morning. Let's make this official. As the call ended, Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The deal had been made. The lease was secured. But the cost, both financial and emotional, was something he couldn't ignore. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jake met with his accountant, reviewed the company's financials, and reached out to investors for help with the deposit. Clint had come through with a loan, offering a financial lifeline, but it still wasn't easy. Jake had to manage every detail, making sure everything was in place for the upcoming months. It was a difficult balancing act. Every penny mattered, and there was no room for error. The pressure mounted as the deposit deadline approached, but Jake held on to the belief that this was the right choice. By Monday morning, Jake had the funds secured. He signed the lease, and the restaurant's future was safe. It wasn't the easy way, and it certainly wasn't the cheap way, but it was the only way that made sense. As he left the landlord's office with the signed contract in hand, Jake felt a mix of relief and pride. He had taken a leap that had pushed him to his limits, forced him to confront his fears, and ultimately proved that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. He called Clint to let him know the good news. We did it, Jake said, the words almost surreal as they left his mouth. The lease is ours. Good job, Jake, Clint replied, a hint of pride in his voice. I knew you could handle it. Jake smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. The future was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of it. Whatever challenges came next, he knew he had what it took to overcome them. As he hung up the phone, he looked around at the bustling restaurant and thought about how far they had come. This was a moment that would define not just the business, but himself. He was no longer just the guy who worked in the kitchen or ran the register. He was the one in charge, the one making the decisions, taking the risks, and steering the ship forward. And for the first time, Jake felt ready to take on whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake's heart raced as he watched the sun rise over the city the next morning. The past few days had been a blur of meetings, phone calls, and anxious moments, but he had successfully navigated the storm and secured the lease. It was a huge victory, one that seemed like the first step towards something bigger. But the weight of everything still pressed down on him. The restaurant was still growing, but Jake knew that he couldn't afford to get complacent. There were still so many challenges ahead, and he had to stay sharp. This wasn't a time to relax, it was a time to push even harder. The day started like any other, with Jake heading into the restaurant early to make sure everything was running smoothly. He stopped by the kitchen to check in with the team. The place was bustling with activity as the chefs prepared for the lunch rush. Everything was in its place, and there was a sense of calm in the air. That calm, however, was short-lived. By mid-morning, Jake received a call from Amanda, the restaurant manager. She was frantic. Jake, there's a problem, she said, her voice shaky. We just got a call from the health inspector. They're coming in for an unscheduled inspection this afternoon. And, there's a chance we might not pass. Jake's stomach dropped. The last thing they needed right now was a health violation. He quickly grabbed his jacket and told Amanda to hold things down while he drove over. The last time the health inspector came around, they had passed with flying colors. There had been a few small issues, some cleaning in the corners of the storage rooms, but nothing major. But now, with so much at stake, one mistake could cost them everything. As Jake drove toward the restaurant, his mind raced. What had gone wrong? Had there been something they missed? Was the restaurant really in danger of failing an inspection? When Jake arrived, Amanda was waiting for him outside, pacing nervously. She was usually calm under pressure, but today, the tension in the air was palpable. Did you get any details from the inspector? Jake asked as he walked up to her. No, Amanda said, shaking her head. They just said they'll be here by 1 o'clock, but didn't give us specifics on what to expect. Jake took a deep breath, trying to keep himself together. All right, let's go inside and make sure everything's in order. We'll be ready when they arrive. As they walked into the restaurant, Jake immediately noticed the slight anxiety that hung over the staff. The usually high-energy environment felt more muted, as everyone sensed the pressure that was building. The staff went about their tasks, but Jake could tell that they were all on edge. All right, team, listen up. Jake called out to the staff, raising his voice so everyone could hear. We're facing an inspection today, and we've got to make sure everything is spotless. Double-check everything. Clean the equipment, the floors, the restrooms, and make sure the kitchen is in perfect shape. We've worked too hard to let this slip through our fingers. The team nodded, and the buzz of activity increased as everyone scrambled to do their part. Jake could see the sense of urgency taking over the kitchen, and he knew that if they all worked together, they could make it through this. It wasn't just about following the rules, it was about showing that they had everything under control. By the time the inspector arrived, the restaurant was shining. Every surface gleamed, the floors had been scrubbed, and every dish had been meticulously cleaned. Amanda had managed to get a few of the staff to double-check the back rooms, and everything appeared to be in order. The inspector, a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform, walked in and immediately started inspecting the premises. He didn't waste any time. His eyes scanned every corner of the kitchen, from the storage area to the cooking stations, from the countertops to the floors. Jake's stomach tightened as he followed the inspector around the restaurant. He didn't know what to expect. The inspector seemed focused but not overly critical, taking his time to examine everything carefully. Every once in a while, he'd make a note in his notebook, but it wasn't clear whether those notes were positive or negative. For what felt like hours, Jake stood by, holding his breath. The inspector finally finished his rounds and walked over to Jake, a serious expression on his face. All right, Mr. Turner, the inspector said, glancing up from his notebook. You've passed the inspection, but there's a small issue with your storage room. It's nothing major, but you'll need to make sure the food items are labeled more clearly and that your inventory is more organized. Jake let out a breath he didn't even realize he had been holding. That's it? He asked, barely able to contain his relief. That's it, the inspector replied, nodding. Just a minor fix. I'll give you a temporary pass, but make sure it's taken care of before I come back for the follow-up. Jake shook the inspector's hand, a sense of victory washing over him. Thank you so much. We'll take care of it right away. As the inspector left, Jake turned to Amanda, who was standing nearby with a wide grin on her face. We did it, she said, a look of pure relief in her eyes. Jake nodded, but the weight of the near miss didn't fully lift from his shoulders. They had dodged a bullet this time, but he knew they couldn't afford to take anything for granted again. There would always be new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. As Jake watched the staff get back to work, he couldn't help but think about what was next. What other obstacles would come their way? Could they keep this momentum going, or was this just the calm before an even bigger storm? Jake knew that every decision from here on out was critical. There was no more room for mistakes. But for now, they had made it through this one. And that, at least, was a victory. The relief from the health inspection passed quickly, and soon enough, Jake found himself back in the trenches. The next few days were filled with the usual hustle and bustle of running a busy restaurant, managing the staff, handling customer complaints, and overseeing inventory. But underneath it all, the looming financial pressure weighed heavily on him. The big deposit for the lease had been paid, and now it was time to make sure they could sustain their cash flow and continue moving forward. The lease was secured, but would they be able to survive in the long term? As the week progressed, Jake couldn't shake the growing sense of urgency. They had passed the inspection, but now came the real test: could they make enough money to keep the doors open? Could they build a strong enough base to weather the storm of high operating costs and make the restaurant profitable? It felt like one step forward and two steps back. Every time they seemed to make progress, new obstacles popped up. Jake sat at the bar in the quiet restaurant early one morning, sipping a cup of coffee and scanning through the financial statements on his laptop. He had already reviewed these numbers countless times, but there was something about seeing them again that made the situation seem even more dire. Despite the increase in foot traffic, revenue wasn't growing as quickly as they needed it to. The cost of ingredients was rising, labor costs were higher than expected, and the margins were razor-thin. Even the most optimistic projections couldn't ignore the reality that they were barely breaking even. "Jake, we need to talk about the numbers," Amanda said, appearing beside him with a folder of paperwork in her hands. She had that familiar look of concern on her face, and Jake knew it was serious. "Yeah, I've been going over them too," Jake replied, rubbing his temples. "I'm not sure we're going to be able to make it through the next quarter if things don't pick up. We're just not bringing in enough money to cover everything." Amanda nodded, sitting down next to him. "I know. We've been doing everything we can to cut costs, but it's still not enough. Our profit margins are too tight. If we don't see an increase in sales soon, we might have to consider cutting back on staff or reducing hours." Jake didn't like the sound of that. Cutting hours or reducing staff would hurt morale, and it would also negatively impact service. They had built a strong team, and Jake knew that losing any of them would be a blow to the restaurant's success. "I don't want to do that," Jake said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "We can't afford to lose any of our people. But I also don't know how much longer we can keep going like this." "Maybe it's time to look at some new strategies," Amanda suggested. "We could try a special menu or add more promotions to draw in customers. What if we launched a loyalty program or ran a special discount for local businesses? Something to build up repeat traffic." Jake thought about it for a moment. Those were good ideas, but they felt like temporary solutions. He needed something more sustainable, something that could give them the breathing room they needed to get back on track. "I don't know if those will work," Jake said, tapping his fingers against the table. "What we need is something bigger. Something that sets us apart from everyone else. We need to make a name for ourselves, stand out in the city. If we can't do that, we're going to struggle." Amanda gave him a skeptical look. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" Jake paused, his eyes drifting toward the door as a group of customers walked in for breakfast. He watched them settle into a booth, chatting and laughing. Then, something clicked. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the experience. What if we create an experience that people can't get anywhere else? Jake said, his voice gaining energy as the idea started to take shape. What if we start offering something exclusive, an event or special night that would draw people in? We could build a community around our restaurant. If people feel like they're a part of something, they'll keep coming back. Amanda raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking about hosting events?" "Exactly. We could do a weekly trivia night, live music on weekends, or even a community dinner where everyone gets to pitch in. Make it more than just a place to eat. Make it a destination. Amanda smiled. That's actually not a bad idea. But do you think it's enough to bring in the kind of traffic we need? Jake leaned back in his chair, considering the possibilities. It's not just about the events. It's about creating something people are willing to talk about. We can leverage social media, get influencers in, and encourage our regulars to spread the word. If we make it fun, people will want to share it with their friends. Amanda nodded, now clearly on board with the idea. It could work. But we'll need to promote it hard. Make sure people know about it ahead of time. We'll need to market this well. Jake smiled, a spark of excitement running through him. I think we're onto something. Let's start planning this week. We'll launch the first event in 2 weeks, something big, something fun. We'll make it the kind of night people won't forget. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of planning, marketing, and preparation. Jake and Amanda worked around the clock to organize the first big event, a KFC cook-off that would allow customers to compete in a chicken frying challenge. They invited local influencers, offered drink specials, and hyped the event on social media. They even printed up posters and flyers to distribute in the surrounding neighborhoods. Jake felt a nervous energy building as the night approached. This was it. This event could either be the thing that launched them into success or the thing that proved their concept wouldn't work. When the night of the event arrived, the restaurant was packed. The energy was electric, and the atmosphere was unlike anything Jake had seen before. People were laughing, chatting, and most importantly, they were having fun. The staff was in high spirits, and the food was flying out of the kitchen. By the time the night ended, Jake knew they had hit on something. The event had been a massive success. Not only had they filled the restaurant, but they had created an experience that people were already talking about. As guests left, they posted about the event on social media, tagged the restaurant, and promised to return. Jake looked around the restaurant, his heart swelling with pride. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The success of the event proved that with the right strategy, they could do more than just survive, they could thrive. But as he stood there, savoring the moment, he also knew one thing: this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to face, but now, for the first time in a long while, Jake felt ready to take them on. Tomorrow, they'd be back at it. But tonight, they could celebrate. They had pulled through. And it felt good. The days following the KFC cook-off were a whirlwind of excitement. Jake and Amanda were riding the high of a successful event, and the restaurant saw a boost in foot traffic. Word had spread through social media, and the restaurant was becoming more and more of a local hotspot. For the first time in weeks, Jake allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. But as the weeks went on, a new threat started to loom on the horizon. It wasn't the health inspector, and it wasn't the financial pressures that had been hanging over their heads. It was something far more insidious: competition. Jake was sitting in his office, going over the latest sales reports, when Amanda entered with a serious look on her face. "Jake, we need to talk," she said, sitting down across from him. "I've been hearing some rumors." Jake looked up from his laptop. "What kind of rumors?" "There's a new restaurant opening just down the street. It's a chain, and it's got some serious backing behind it. They've been marketing it heavily, and they've got deep pockets. I'm worried they're going to steal away our customers." Jake's heart sank. He'd heard whispers of new businesses coming to the area, but he hadn't paid much attention to them. This was different. If a big-name chain was setting up shop so close, they would be a formidable competitor. "Do you know when they're opening?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Next week," Amanda replied. "They've got billboards up, and their social media presence is huge. I've already seen some of our regulars talking about checking it out." Jake's mind raced. This was exactly the kind of thing he feared. After all the work they had put in, all the events and promotions, here was an outside force that could undo it all. People were fickle. They loved novelty, and a big-name chain with deep pockets could easily lure them away. "We can't just sit back and hope it goes away," Jake said, clenching his fists in frustration. "We need to act fast." Amanda nodded. "What's our plan?" Jake stood up and started pacing, his mind spinning. "We need to double down on what makes us different. We've got the personal touch, the experience. Let's build on that. We need to create a buzz that they can't replicate." He turned to Amanda, his eyes alight with determination. "We've got to go even bigger. If we keep up with the events and bring in more unique experiences, we'll build a loyal customer base that won't be easily swayed." Amanda raised an eyebrow. "What exactly do you have in mind?" Jake paused, thinking about what would set them apart. "What if we started doing themed nights? Maybe a chicken and jazz night, live jazz music and a special chicken-based menu. Or even a movie and meal night where we show cult classic films and pair them with a family-style meal. We could tap into that local community vibe that chains like that can never match." Amanda looked thoughtful. "I love those ideas. They feel different, and they could definitely pull people in. But we'll need a way to push them out to the public quickly." Jake walked over to the whiteboard in his office and started sketching out a plan. "We'll promote on social media, of course, but let's also partner with local businesses. We can offer discounts for their employees if they come in, and they'll spread the word. We'll also need to get local influencers involved again, maybe even hold a contest where people can win free tickets to one of these events." Amanda nodded, impressed. "That's aggressive, but I think it could work. We can't let them steal our momentum. We've got to get in front of them." The next few days were a blur as Jake and Amanda worked around the clock to put their plan into motion. They reached out to local musicians, filmmakers, and other vendors to partner with the restaurant. They revamped their social media presence, posting sneak peeks of the upcoming themed nights and highlighting the exclusive atmosphere they were creating. It was all about building excitement and making sure everyone knew this wasn't just another restaurant, it was an experience. The first themed night, Chicken and Jazz, arrived sooner than Jake had expected. The restaurant was transformed, dim lighting, candles on the tables, and the soft sounds of a local jazz band filled the air. The menu featured a mix of gourmet fried chicken dishes paired with wine, and the atmosphere was electric. It wasn't just the food that was drawing people in, it was the ambience, the community, and the sense that they were a part of something bigger. The event was a hit, and Jake could already see the impact on social media as customers tagged the restaurant and posted pictures of their night. The following week, they rolled out Movie and Meal Night. Jake worked closely with local theaters to secure the rights to screen classic films, and they paired each movie with a themed meal. The night was a complete success, and the restaurant became the go-to place for a fun, different kind of dining experience. But just as they were starting to gain traction, the new chain restaurant opened down the street. Jake knew this would be the true test. The competition had arrived, and now it was time to see if their new strategy would be enough to keep their momentum going. On the night of the chain's grand opening, Jake drove by the new restaurant to see what all the hype was about. It was sleek, modern, and had a large line out the door. The marketing had clearly worked. They had successfully drawn in a crowd with their flashy ads and deep pockets. Jake clenched his jaw as he watched people eagerly waiting to get in. He couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. They had the resources, the name recognition, and all the advantages of a big corporation. But they didn't have the personal touch. They didn't have the heart and soul that Jake and his team had poured into the restaurant. "We're not out yet," Jake muttered to himself. He turned the car around and headed back to his own restaurant. Later that evening, Jake sat at the bar, watching the crowd of loyal customers in his own restaurant. They were chatting, laughing, and enjoying their meals. He glanced over at Amanda, who was overseeing the kitchen. They had done everything they could to stand out. Now it was up to their community, their loyal customers, and their unique experience to make the difference. Jake smiled. They weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. It was going to be a long road, but this was their fight. And they weren't backing down. The first few weeks following the chain restaurant's opening were a blur. Jake kept his head down, focusing on keeping the momentum from their themed nights while dealing with the constant pressure of competing with a big-name competitor. They were managing to keep their loyal customers, but every day felt like a battle. Every night, Jake stayed up late, making plans, adjusting their strategies, and pushing his team to work harder. Despite their best efforts, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the odds were beginning to stack up against them. The chain restaurant down the street was relentless in its marketing campaigns, pouring money into advertisements that could reach thousands of people in an instant. And with its slick design and corporate backing, it had the power to lure in new customers, especially those unfamiliar with the local dining scene. Jake was exhausted. The restaurant was doing well, but it wasn't enough. They were hanging on by a thread. One evening, after another successful movie and meal night, Jake sat at the bar with Amanda, sipping on a glass of bourbon. The place was quieter now, with only a few patrons left enjoying their meals. The afterglow of the evening's event had worn off, and the stress had started to creep in again. "We're doing everything we can, but it's still not enough," Jake muttered, his eyes tired. "I see more people walking out of the door of the chain restaurant than ever before. We've got great events, but it feels like we're just spinning our wheels." Amanda leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "I know. I feel it too. We've got the heart and soul, but they've got everything else. It's tough, Jake." Jake stared into his drink, contemplating their next move. The idea of cutting back or downsizing was something he could barely fathom. The thought of losing everything they had worked so hard for seemed impossible, but the reality was creeping in, and the pressure was unbearable. "I don't know how much longer we can do this," Jake said quietly. "We're burning through money trying to stay afloat. The restaurant is still profitable, but it's not enough to make up for what we're spending to keep up." Amanda's eyes softened. "Jake, we've been through so much together. We've overcome obstacles that others would have given up on. Don't give up now. We need to make a decision before we lose it all. Either we push harder, or we walk away." Jake felt a pang of panic. Walking away wasn't an option. They'd come too far for that. The restaurant had become his life. It was more than just a business, it was his dream. "We're not walking away," Jake said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "We can't. We've worked too hard, and we owe it to the team and the customers who've supported us to fight for this." Amanda nodded. "Then what's the next step?" Jake stared ahead, lost in thought. There had to be something they hadn't tried yet. There had to be something they could do that would give them the edge they needed to survive. Something bold, something that would make them stand out even more. "I've got an idea," Jake said suddenly, his eyes lighting up. "We need to make this restaurant a local institution. We need to be the place everyone in this town talks about. We need to be more than just a place to eat, we need to be a symbol of this community." Amanda raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" Jake stood up, pacing around the bar. "We can't keep playing catch-up. We've got to take a risk. What if we opened up our doors to the community in a way that's never been done before? Not just with events, but with something that goes deeper. Something that makes us irreplaceable." Amanda followed him with her eyes. "What do you mean?" Jake turned to her with excitement in his eyes. "We partner with local farmers, local businesses, and local organizations. We become the heart of this town. We source everything locally, every ingredient, every product. We build relationships with people in the community, make them a part of our journey. We host events that are focused on local issues, and we use our platform to give back. Amanda's expression softened as she processed what Jake was saying. So, instead of competing with them on their level, we make our business about the people. About supporting local. We make ourselves indispensable to this community. Jake smiled. Exactly. We're not just serving food. We're serving the community. And that's something the chain can't replicate. No matter how much money they throw at advertising, they can't buy the loyalty we can build by being involved in people's lives. We have to make it personal. And that means everything we do, from our menu to our events to our charity work, reflects the people who walk through our doors every day. Amanda leaned back, considering the idea. That could work. It's bold, but it makes sense. People want to feel like they're part of something bigger. We could be that for them. Jake's pulse quickened. Exactly. We start with something simple, maybe a partnership with the local farmers market, where we host events every week, featuring fresh ingredients and local artisans. We can show people the value of supporting their own community and make them feel like they're helping something bigger by choosing to eat with us. Amanda grinned. That's brilliant. We'll start small, but we can build on it. We could even host cooking classes with local chefs, do food drives, or sponsor local sports teams. The possibilities are endless. Jake nodded, already formulating a plan. We make this about the town. About its people. And we let the chain restaurant do what they do best, be a soulless corporate entity that only cares about profits. We'll win the hearts of this community, and that's something they'll never be able to take away from us. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and action. Jake and Amanda got to work, reaching out to local farmers, small business owners, and organizations that shared their vision. They built partnerships with local coffee roasters, bakers, and craft breweries. They revamped the restaurant's menu, focusing on farm-to-table dishes that highlighted local ingredients and gave customers a taste of the town's best produce. They also started hosting community-driven events, local artist exhibitions, charity dinners, and food tasting nights that featured the best of local cuisine. Word quickly spread, and people began to notice. The restaurant was no longer just a place to eat, it had become a symbol of community pride. Business picked up. But more importantly, the loyalty of their customers deepened. The restaurant had become a gathering place, a hub for the town's social life. And no amount of money, advertising, or corporate backing could replicate that. As Jake watched the restaurant bustle with life during one of their events, he knew they had found their way. It was a long road, but they had finally found something that worked. Now, it was time to push even harder and make sure their success was here to stay. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. And they were ready to face whatever came next. The weeks following their bold pivot were a whirlwind of activity. Jake and Amanda could hardly keep up with the demand from the community, and their partnership with local farmers and artisans began to pay off. The restaurant became a beacon of pride in the town, a place where people gathered not just to eat, but to share stories, ideas, and a sense of belonging. Jake stood in the restaurant one morning, watching the first few customers trickle in for the day. He'd arrived early to make sure everything was in order. The decor was warm, welcoming, and uniquely personal. The walls were adorned with local artwork, and handwritten menus listed the names of nearby farms and suppliers who had contributed to the dishes. As the morning rush began, Amanda walked in with a smile. She seemed energized, despite the late nights they'd been working. It was clear that something was shifting. "Good morning, boss," she teased, walking up to him as she slid behind the bar to prep for the busy day ahead. "I think the word is finally getting out. We've got a steady crowd coming in for lunch already. The local papers have been covering us more, and the social media posts keep coming." Jake grinned. "I saw that. There's a buzz in the air, isn't there? I think we're actually doing it." They had pushed through the early turbulence of competing with the flashy new chain down the street, but now they were finally starting to see the results. With each passing day, more locals were choosing their restaurant over the competition. The idea of building a community-first, locally sourced dining experience had struck a chord with their customers. People were coming back, bringing friends, and talking about the restaurant with pride. But Jake knew that this wasn't a win just yet. It wasn't enough to just survive. He had to make sure that this was sustainable. That their success wasn't just a flash in the pan, but something solid that would stand the test of time. "We need to push harder, Amanda," Jake said, his voice steady, but filled with purpose. "We've done a great job, but this is just the beginning. We need to double down on our community efforts, create programs that keep people engaged, get them involved in what we're doing. It's not enough to just serve them a good meal anymore. We've got to make them feel like they're part of something special." Amanda raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" Jake took a deep breath and leaned on the counter, thinking of his next steps. "I've been thinking we should start a rewards program for locals, like a membership that gives them access to exclusive events, discounts, and even the chance to contribute ideas to our menu. We'll also need to host even more events, but make them more interactive, more personal." Amanda's eyes lit up. "I love that idea. A rewards program would make people feel invested. And interactive events. We could even get kids involved, or host family nights where people bring in their recipes and we cook them for a night. Get the whole town talking." Jake nodded. "Exactly. Let's take this to the next level. We're not just a restaurant, we're a movement. A community that people can't resist being a part of. The chains can't replicate that. They don't know this town like we do." By the end of the week, they'd begun implementing the new ideas. Jake worked with the team to create a loyalty program that rewarded frequent customers with discounts and exclusive access to certain nights, while Amanda worked on developing interactive events. They even launched a community recipe night, where locals could submit their favorite family recipes for a chance to have it featured on the menu. The response was immediate. The loyalty program brought in a surge of repeat customers who felt like they were part of the restaurant's success. The community recipe night was a hit as well, with residents excited to share their culinary traditions. People who had once only walked into the restaurant for a quick meal were now bringing in their families, their friends, and their neighbors to be part of something they could all connect with. One evening, after the second community recipe night, Jake stood at the bar with a drink in hand, watching the crowd. It was a full house, people chatting, laughing, and eating together like one big family. Amanda joined him, her eyes scanning the room with the same sense of pride that Jake felt. "You were right, Jake. People want to feel like they belong. Like they're part of something bigger," she said quietly, her gaze softening. Jake nodded. "I can't believe we're actually doing it. We've turned it around. This is real." As the night wore on, Jake's phone buzzed with a message from a local news outlet. They had caught wind of the restaurant's recent success and were eager to feature them in an upcoming story. It was the kind of attention they needed to keep building their momentum. But even with all the positive changes, Jake still felt the weight of the chain restaurant's presence looming in the background. He knew they had made significant strides, but the fight wasn't over. There were still many battles to come. And then, in the middle of this resurgence, a new challenge arose. A well-known food critic from a major local magazine reached out and requested to review the restaurant. On the surface, this seemed like a dream come true. A positive review from a respected critic could skyrocket their popularity, bringing in customers from all over the region. But Jake couldn't ignore the pressure. If the critic's review wasn't favorable, it could deal a blow to everything they'd worked for. Amanda could sense Jake's unease. "What's wrong?" Jake turned to her, his face serious. "The food critic is coming in next week. We can't afford a bad review, Amanda. This could make or break us." Amanda placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've come so far, Jake. We've faced worse. All we can do is show up, give it our best, and let the rest fall into place. Jake looked at her, his expression softening. You're right. We've come this far. Whatever happens, we're going to give it everything we've got. The next week, Jake and Amanda went over every detail of the restaurant. The menu, the staff, the ambience, it all had to be perfect. This wasn't just about food, it was about the experience they had worked so hard to create. On the night the critic arrived, Jake watched from a distance as the reviewer sat down at a table, pen in hand, observing every detail. Jake took a deep breath, hoping that their passion and dedication would shine through. As the night progressed, Jake couldn't shake the nervous energy in the air. He kept an eye on the critic, noticing the small gestures, the way he smiled after every bite of food, the way he looked around, taking in the atmosphere. There was something hopeful in those little moments. By the end of the meal, the critic was satisfied, nodding with approval as he finished his dessert. Jake exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The next day, the review hit the local newsstands and social media. To Jake's relief, it was glowing. The critic praised the restaurant for its innovation, the quality of its food, and the heart of the community it had built. They were officially a success, recognized not just for the food, but for the unique experience they provided. The phone started ringing with new reservations, and social media exploded with praise. The turnaround was real, and it was only just beginning. But in the back of Jake's mind, one thought lingered: they couldn't rest. There were still bigger challenges ahead, and the chain restaurant wasn't done fighting. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt the stirring of something he hadn't felt in a while: hope. The battle was far from over, but maybe, just maybe, they were winning. The restaurant's surge in popularity was undeniable. Jake and Amanda watched with a mixture of pride and relief as their efforts finally began to bear fruit. For the first time in months, the pressure of constant survival seemed to ease. The restaurant had become a community staple, its name appearing in local news outlets, social media feeds, and even on word-of-mouth tips passed between friends. The critics' glowing review had cemented their place in the town's dining scene. But Jake knew better than to get too comfortable. He had seen firsthand how quickly things could change, especially in a competitive market. Success could be fleeting if they didn't stay ahead of the game. One morning, as Jake opened up the restaurant, his phone buzzed with an email. He opened it, and his stomach dropped. It was from the corporate chain restaurant down the street. The subject line read, "Final offer, buyout proposal." Jake's heart pounded as he read through the email. The chain restaurant was offering to buy out his restaurant and absorb it into their brand. It was a tempting offer, an enormous sum of money that could secure Jake's future and ease the financial strain. But there was a catch: it meant selling out. Giving up everything they had worked for. The email ended with the words, "We believe your brand would fit well under our umbrella, providing the best of both worlds for your loyal customers and our growing network." Jake put the phone down slowly, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just about money, it was about what they had built. Was this their chance to finally secure the future of the restaurant, or was it the beginning of losing everything they had worked so hard to create? Amanda walked into the kitchen just as Jake was lost in thought. She noticed the expression on his face immediately. "Hey, you all right?" she asked, concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake didn't say anything at first. He handed her the phone, and she read the email. Her face, too, became serious as she finished. "Are they serious?" Amanda asked, her voice low. Jake sighed. "They want to buy us out. A lot of money is on the table." Amanda stared at the phone, clearly conflicted. "I don't know, Jake. This could solve a lot of problems. The financial pressure, the sleepless nights, the constant fight to stay competitive, it could all be over with one signature." Jake felt a pang in his chest. That's the thing. It could be the end. But it's also the end of everything we've worked for. We'd be another cog in their machine. I built this place with the idea that it was ours. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the community, the relationships. I'm not sure I'm ready to give that up. Amanda was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke. I get it. I do. But there's a part of me that wonders if we've taken it as far as we can. Maybe we're never going to beat them. Maybe this is the smart thing to do. Jake knew that she was just trying to be realistic. But he couldn't help the fire that still burned inside him. I know it's a huge risk, but I'm not ready to just give up. I want to keep fighting. I believe in what we're doing here. Amanda looked at him for a long time before responding. I'm with you, Jake. Whatever you decide, I'm in. We'll make this work, together. Jake's mind raced as the decision weighed heavily on him. The buyout offer was tempting. It would solve so many of their problems in an instant. But deep down, he knew that selling out would mean abandoning the very thing they had built from scratch. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. The offer from the chain restaurant kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. Was he making the right choice by holding out? Or was he being stubborn, clinging to a dream that was no longer realistic? The next morning, he met with Amanda, and the two of them went over their options again. They sat at a table, their heads full of ideas, as the usual morning bustle began to fill the restaurant. The crew was preparing for another busy day, but Jake couldn't shake the weight on his shoulders. We need to keep pushing the local angle, Jake said, his voice steady but urgent. We can't let them steal the heart of this town. What if we went all in on becoming the community's restaurant? What if we made sure that every part of this place screamed local? Amanda nodded, already seeing the direction Jake was heading. You're talking about full immersion. Getting even more involved. Events, partnerships, promotions, everything. We become the go-to place, not just for food, but for everything that makes this town unique. Exactly, Jake said, his voice gaining energy. We stop looking at them as competition. Instead, we make them irrelevant by becoming the irreplaceable part of this town. If we can get everyone on board with that, there's no way they'll ever be able to buy us out or replicate what we have. Amanda smiled. I think that's the plan, Jake. Let's do it. Let's make this place so ingrained in the community that no one can imagine the town without us. The next few weeks saw a whirlwind of activity as they doubled down on their community efforts. They launched a new initiative called Taste of the Town, where they featured a different local business every month. From coffee roasters to artisans, farmers to brewers, they showcased the best their community had to offer. They also started offering cooking classes for kids, hosting charity auctions, and partnering with local schools for fundraising events. The restaurant became a gathering place for all ages, backgrounds, and interests. Jake was busier than ever, but he had never felt more alive. Every day, he saw the impact they were making. Customers were no longer just people who walked in for a meal, they were loyal supporters, partners in the restaurant's success. And it wasn't just the locals who were noticing. Visitors from neighboring towns began traveling to eat at Jake's restaurant, drawn by the stories of its connection to the community. But the challenge wasn't over. The corporate chain restaurant down the street was starting to feel the heat. Their glossy ads couldn't match the heartfelt, personal connections Jake's restaurant had built with the people who frequented it. The chain's efforts to copy the local vibe fell flat. They didn't understand what made the town unique. Jake was more determined than ever to keep pushing forward, and the pressure to succeed had never been more intense. The offer to sell out still lingered, and the temptation was strong. But every day, the support from the community reminded him why he couldn't give up. This was more than just a restaurant, it was a movement, a way of life that no amount of money could replace. Jake knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt confident. He had a team behind him, a community that believed in him, and a restaurant that was thriving. It wasn't just a battle against a chain anymore, it was a fight to protect what was his. And he was ready to win. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on Jake and Amanda only intensified. The Taste of the Town initiative had been a massive success, and the restaurant was busier than ever. It seemed like the community was rallying behind them more than ever, but Jake couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the fight wasn't over. The corporate chain restaurant down the street had started to adjust its strategy. They were offering discount days to attract customers, running flashy social media campaigns, and even throwing their own community events to try and mimic the local feel that Jake's restaurant had perfected. It was clear that they were feeling the heat, and Jake knew that they weren't about to give up without a fight. One afternoon, as Jake sat in his office going through the day's financials, Amanda burst in, her face tight with concern. "You need to see this," she said, her voice urgent. She handed Jake a phone with the screen facing him. He glanced down at it, seeing a post from the corporate chain's social media account. It was an image of a new community program they had just launched, Hometown Heroes Night, a special evening where local heroes, firefighters, police officers, teachers, and more, could get a free meal, thanks to the generosity of the restaurant. Jake felt his pulse quicken. The chain had clearly taken a page out of their book, trying to claim the same local charm that had made his restaurant a hit. "Are you kidding me?" Jake muttered under his breath. "They're literally copying us." Amanda took a deep breath. "They're trying to, but we've already built something they can't replicate. People are invested in us, what we stand for. They can't just throw a few free meals at people and expect to win." Jake looked at her, still upset. "It's not just a few free meals, Amanda. They've got the resources to flood the town with promotions. They've got deep pockets. This could hurt us." They both knew that while Jake's restaurant had the heart of the community, the corporate chain had the financial muscle to push them out if they wanted to. Jake had spent sleepless nights worrying about the competition, and this move felt like a direct challenge to everything they had worked for. The next few days were a blur of emotions and frantic planning. Jake knew he couldn't just sit back and let the chain steal their spotlight. But what could he do? He called a team meeting early one morning. The staff gathered in the back room, and Jake stood in front of them, trying to keep his nerves in check. "I'm sure you all know by now that the corporate chain is starting to make some moves," Jake began, his voice steady but serious. "They're throwing discounts and freebies our way. And while we've built something amazing with the community, we can't ignore the fact that they're trying to steal what we've worked for." The room was silent. Then, one of the cooks, Mike, spoke up. "We've got the people, Jake. They're loyal. They know what we're about. We're not just a place to eat, we're a place that gives back." Amanda nodded. "Exactly. We've been doing this the right way from the start. And we're not about to back down now." Jake smiled, feeling reassured by the support of his team. But he knew that it wasn't enough to just stand firm. They needed to step up their game, and fast. Over the next few days, Jake and Amanda brainstormed ideas to keep their momentum going. They needed to go beyond just the food and the local ingredients that had defined them. It was time to get more creative, more personal, and more involved than ever before. "We need to remind people why we're here in the first place," Jake said as they discussed their strategy over coffee. "It's not just about great food, it's about building a community. And that's something they can't replicate. We need to make them feel like they're part of our story." Amanda tapped her finger on the table, thinking. "What if we threw a community appreciation week? Like, a week-long celebration with special events, discounts, live music, and even workshops. We could highlight the businesses and people who make this town what it is." Jake's eyes lit up. "Yes. That's perfect. We need to shine a spotlight on the people who have supported us all along. We can host everything from cooking classes to farmer meet and greets. And let's make it about the town, not just us." Amanda grinned. "We'll turn the tables. Make them feel like they're the stars. We're not just the restaurant, they're the reason we're here." They got to work planning the event. Over the next week, they set up partnerships with local musicians, artists, and makers. They organized cooking classes, wine pairings, and special tastings that showcased their local suppliers. Every evening would feature something different: live music on Monday, a local beer tasting on Tuesday, and family movie nights for the kids. The idea was to turn their restaurant into a week-long celebration of everything that made their town unique. They called it the Hometown Celebration Week. The response was electric. Local businesses, eager to support Jake and Amanda, jumped on board, offering services, food, and goods for the event. The community rallied behind them, posting about the event on social media, buying tickets, and sharing their excitement. For the first time in months, Jake felt like they were pulling ahead again. The event kicked off with a bustling atmosphere on the first night, with families walking in, kids in tow, and a line out the door. As the week progressed, the turnout only grew. The restaurant was packed every night, filled with familiar faces and new ones, all eager to participate in the celebration of the town. Jake and Amanda worked tirelessly, greeting guests, checking in with staff, and making sure that the night's activities went off without a hitch. The live music performances drew crowds, and the local artisans set up booths, displaying everything from handmade jewelry to fresh produce. But it wasn't just the events that made this week a success, it was the sense of unity and pride that the Hometown Celebration Week inspired. People weren't just there for the food or the discounts, they were there because they felt part of something bigger. It was a celebration of their town, their people, and everything that made it special. By the end of the week, the restaurant had exceeded its expectations. The buzz around town was palpable, and even local news outlets had picked up on the event, posting stories and photos about the community's incredible turnout. Word had spread far beyond the town's limits, and Jake knew that their reputation had grown stronger than ever before. But the fight wasn't over yet. The corporate chain restaurant may have been trying to match them, but it was clear that they still hadn't captured the essence of what Jake's restaurant was all about. They had won this battle, but Jake knew that the war wasn't over. He'd continue to fight for the heart of his community, because that was what mattered. The restaurant was more than just a business. It was a reflection of the people who had made it possible, and he would protect that, no matter what. The Hometown Celebration Week had shown them one thing: when the community stood together, nothing could tear it down. After the overwhelming success of the Hometown Celebration Week, things seemed to be moving in the right direction again. Jake and Amanda had breathed a sigh of relief, feeling that they had not only held their ground but expanded their influence in the town. Business was booming, the community was more invested than ever, and even the staff seemed more motivated, energized by the growth they'd experienced together. But beneath the surface, a storm was quietly brewing. Jake had always known that the corporate chain restaurant wouldn't back down so easily. They had more resources, more locations, and an undeniable presence. The competition was far from over, and Jake's gut told him that something big was coming. It wasn't just about promotions anymore, it was about power moves, corporate maneuvers that could shake everything he had worked for to its core. One day, as Jake sat at his desk, a phone call came in. It was an unknown number. "Hello, this is Jake," he answered, expecting another routine call from a supplier or local business partner. "Jake, it's Tim at the corporate restaurant down the street," said a voice that sounded far too casual for what Jake suspected was about to happen. "I wanted to reach out and see if we could have a conversation. Nothing too formal. Just a chat." Jake's brow furrowed. He knew that name. Tim was the district manager for the chain, the guy in charge of overseeing the company's expansion efforts in the region. Jake had heard whispers that the corporate chain was preparing to make a big move, an acquisition, a new restaurant opening, but this unexpected call had him on edge. "What's this about, Tim?" Jake replied, his voice cautious. "I won't beat around the bush," Tim said. "We've been watching the success of your restaurant closely, and we believe there's a lot of potential for you, Jake. We're growing our portfolio, and we're interested in discussing the possibility of you joining our team. I think we can offer you a very competitive package. We've seen what you've done with your local branding, and we think it could benefit from the support of our resources. Jake was taken aback. The offer was exactly what he had been dreading, a direct approach from the enemy, trying to pull him in. He tried to maintain his composure. So, you're saying you want to buy us out? Not exactly, Tim responded smoothly. We're looking for a partnership. A way to work together. We understand your brand, Jake. We just think it could thrive even more with the right backing. Think of it as an opportunity to expand on what you've built. Jake's mind was spinning. The proposal sounded very similar to the buyout offer they had received months ago, but this time, it was framed as a partnership, a more tempting and less final-sounding offer. They weren't asking him to give up his restaurant completely, but they were suggesting a merger of sorts. They could give him the financial stability and resources to grow beyond his wildest dreams, but at what cost? Would it still be his restaurant? Would it remain the place that the community loved? I'll have to think about it, Jake said, his voice flat. He could feel Amanda's eyes on him from across the room, and he knew she'd be just as cautious about this proposal as he was. Take your time, Tim said. But we're serious about making something happen. Let's talk soon. As Jake ended the call, he stared at the phone in his hand, his thoughts churning. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a casual conversation. The corporate chain was closing in on him, and they had identified him as a key piece in their expansion strategy. They wanted him in their corner, and they were willing to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. He turned to Amanda, who had walked over to his desk, sensing his tension. That was Tim from the corporate chain, Jake said, his voice tight. Amanda's face immediately fell. Oh no. What did he say? They want to partner, Jake replied, making air quotes. They're offering to back us financially, help us grow, in exchange for, well, a piece of us. It's not a buyout, but it's the same idea. They want us to join their team. To be one of their brands. Amanda was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the information. That sounds like what they've been trying to do all along. They want control. Jake nodded. Exactly. They can offer us a ton of money and resources, but it would mean losing the very thing we've built here. The soul of the restaurant. It wouldn't be ours anymore. Amanda looked at him, her expression serious. So, what's next? Are we going to fight back, or is this the end of the road? Jake rubbed his temples. The weight of the decision was heavier than ever. I don't know, Amanda. The temptation is real. They've got the money, the power, the marketing machine behind them. But we've got something they don't have, our community. Amanda's eyes softened, and she put a hand on Jake's shoulder. You know what you have to do, Jake. You can't sell out to them. Not after everything we've done. We didn't come this far to hand it over. Jake looked up at her, his mind still racing, but a sense of clarity beginning to take shape. You're right. This is about more than just money. We've built something that's real. That matters. I won't let them take that from us. Later that evening, as the restaurant closed and the final customers trickled out, Jake found himself alone at the bar, staring at the empty seats where families had gathered just hours before. The restaurant felt different now. Quieter. More contemplative. Amanda sat beside him, her presence grounding him as the weight of the decision pressed in on him. You're not going to sell, are you? She asked softly. Jake took a deep breath. No. I'm not. It's time to go all in. We've fought for this place, Amanda. I won't give it up now. The decision had been made. Jake wasn't going to let the corporate chain take over his vision. He had everything he needed to keep moving forward, his team, the community, and the undeniable passion that had driven him from the very beginning. They had won battles before, and they would win this one too. But it wouldn't come without its challenges. Jake knew that the corporate chain wasn't going to stop. The war wasn't over yet. And the next fight might be the hardest one yet. In the days that followed, Jake knew that he was facing the ultimate test. The corporate chain would be relentless in their attempts to undermine him. But Jake wasn't about to back down. This was his restaurant. His community. And he would fight to the very end to protect what was his. The battle was far from over, but Jake was ready. Jake had made his decision. There was no turning back. The corporate chain's offer had been tempting, but he knew in his heart that it wasn't the right path. The restaurant, the community, and everything they had built was too important to give up for a quick payout. But as the days wore on, the pressure intensified. The corporate chain wasn't going to just let him walk away without a fight. The rumors began circulating around town, whispers of corporate buyouts, new restaurant openings, and aggressive marketing campaigns. It was clear that the competition wasn't going to stop. If anything, it had just escalated. The corporate chain had already begun running even more promotional campaigns, offering larger discounts, flash sales, and local events, trying to draw attention away from Jake's restaurant. But Jake wasn't backing down. He knew that in order to keep his restaurant alive and thriving, he would need to take things to the next level. It was time for the final push, a move that would solidify the restaurant's place in the heart of the community for good. The idea came to Jake late one night as he sat in the office, looking at the financials again. They were still in the black, but the numbers were tightening. He needed something big to keep the momentum going. He turned to Amanda, who had been working alongside him throughout the entire process. What if we expanded the idea of Hometown Celebration Week into something bigger? Something that could get people talking, and bring more attention to our restaurant? Amanda raised an eyebrow. Bigger than the celebration week? You mean like, a full-on festival? Exactly, Jake said, his voice gaining excitement. A festival celebrating everything about this town, the food, the people, the culture. A full weekend event that draws people in from all over the region. Local vendors, artists, music, food trucks. We'll bring the whole town together and make it an annual tradition. They'll come for the food and the fun, but what they'll leave with is a deeper connection to this place. Amanda nodded slowly, clearly thinking it through. It's a big move, Jake. It's risky. But I think you're right. It's something that could define us. We've always said it's about community. If we really put our heart into it, people will feel it. Jake smiled. That's the plan. We'll make it clear that this is about our town. This isn't just a restaurant anymore, it's a movement. They got to work immediately. Jake reached out to local businesses, vendors, and musicians. He enlisted the help of the town's Chamber of Commerce and various community organizations. They needed sponsors, volunteers, and of course, the talent to make the event something truly special. As word spread about the idea, the town's response was overwhelming. Everyone wanted to get involved. The festival, which they decided to call the Hometown Harvest Festival, was set to take place in the town square, and it quickly became the most talked about event of the year. The festival would feature local food trucks, a beer garden with selections from local breweries, live music, cooking demonstrations, arts and crafts vendors, and even a kids' corner with games and activities. Jake also decided to add a special touch, an open-air stage where local musicians could perform, and community leaders could speak about the importance of supporting local businesses. The event would be free to attend, with funds raised from food and merchandise sales going to local charities. Jake knew this event would take his restaurant's connection to the town to new heights. This wasn't just about attracting customers, it was about building a lasting legacy. The corporate chain could throw discounts and promotions all they wanted, but they couldn't replicate the heart of what Jake and Amanda had built. The Hometown Harvest Festival would prove that. The days leading up to the festival were a whirlwind. Volunteers were working around the clock to set up booths, tents, and stages. Local businesses were donating their goods, and every single person in the town seemed to be involved in making the event a success. But amidst all the excitement, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the corporate chain was watching closely, waiting for an opening to pounce. He knew they wouldn't let this event slip away without a counterattack. Then, a week before the festival, Jake got an email. It was from Tim, the district manager of the corporate chain. "Jake, I hear you've got something big planned," the email began. "I'm impressed by the community spirit you've created. It's clear you've done some great work there. But we want you to know that we're here to offer our support for the event. We'd be happy to provide some of our resources to make it even bigger. We can set up a booth at the festival, provide free giveaways, and even sponsor some of the entertainment." Jake's stomach sank. He knew exactly what was going on. This wasn't an offer of support. This was a move to insert themselves into the heart of the event, to take credit for the success that was all his and Amanda's doing. They were trying to muscle their way into the festival to steal some of the spotlight. Jake's first instinct was to say no outright, but he knew he needed to keep his cool. He wasn't about to let them hijack his event. Not after everything they had worked for. He shot an email back, keeping it professional. "Thank you for your offer, Tim. However, this event is about celebrating the people and businesses that have built this community from the ground up. We've already got everything we need, and we prefer to keep the focus on our local partners." Jake hit send and sat back in his chair, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He knew that standing firm now would send a clear message to everyone: this was his restaurant, his community, and no corporate giant would take that away. The day of the hometown harvest festival arrived, and the streets of the town were buzzing with excitement. The event exceeded all expectations. Hundreds of people packed the town square, filling it with laughter, music, and the delicious smells of local food. The festival was a hit. People of all ages were enjoying the day, chatting with vendors, listening to music, and eating at the food trucks. Jake and Amanda walked around, greeting familiar faces and soaking in the atmosphere. The sense of pride and unity was palpable. Jake looked out over the crowd, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. They had done it. Despite the corporate chain's attempts to undermine them, the hometown harvest festival was a success. It was a celebration of everything they had worked for, and it was clear that the community was fully behind them. As the day wound down, Jake found himself standing near the stage, watching a local band perform. He turned to Amanda, who was standing beside him, her eyes glowing with pride. "We did it," Jake said, his voice full of emotion. Amanda smiled. "We did it. This is just the beginning, Jake. We've got something special here. And nothing, not even a corporate giant, can take that away." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words. This was more than just a restaurant. It was a reflection of the heart of the town, and as long as he stayed true to that, nothing could tear them apart. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like they were winning. And the best part? The community had his back. The dust had settled from the hometown harvest festival, and the town of Willow Creek was buzzing with talk of the event. It had far surpassed anyone's expectations. Local families had gathered together, neighbors had bonded over food and music, and Jake's restaurant had taken center stage. There was a renewed sense of pride in the air, and Jake could feel the energy in the streets every time he walked into the restaurant. But the festival was just the beginning. As the weeks passed, Jake's phone kept ringing off the hook. Not with calls from corporate chains or rivals, but from local businesses, food critics, and even regional news stations. They wanted to cover the success of the hometown harvest festival, the story of the restaurant that had brought the town together in the face of overwhelming corporate pressure. Jake had become a local hero, not because he had the biggest restaurant or the most resources, but because he had stayed true to his values. He had built something that wasn't just about food, it was about people. It was about supporting the community that had supported him. And that message resonated, far beyond the borders of Willow Creek. Then, one quiet afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It was an official-looking envelope from the corporate restaurant chain, the one that had been attempting to buy Jake out for months. Jake opened it with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Dear Jake," it began. "We have been closely following your efforts in Willow Creek, and we must say that we are impressed by your success. While we would still like to explore potential opportunities for collaboration, we understand that you have made it clear that your loyalty lies with your community. We respect that decision. Moving forward, we would like to assure you that we no longer intend to pursue a partnership or acquisition of your restaurant. We will, of course, continue to operate in the area, but we will not attempt to undermine the success you've worked so hard to achieve." Jake read the letter several times, his mind racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the corporate chain had finally recognized the strength of his resolve. It wasn't just a victory for his restaurant. It was a victory for the people of Willow Creek. He put the letter down and let out a long, deep breath. This wasn't just about surviving, it was about winning. And not just winning for himself, but for everyone who had supported him along the way. That evening, Jake invited Amanda over to his place for dinner. The restaurant was closed, the kitchen quiet for the first time in what felt like months. He pulled a bottle of wine from the fridge and poured them both a glass as they sat down at the table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Amanda raised an eyebrow, sensing the change in his demeanor. "What's going on, Jake? You look like you just won the lottery." Jake grinned and passed her the letter. "I think we just did," he said, his voice filled with pride. Amanda's eyes scanned the letter, and when she finished reading it, she looked up at Jake, her smile widening. "They're backing off. They're finally backing off." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of relief. "Yeah. They realized they can't beat us. Not like this. Not when we have the community behind us." Amanda took a long sip of wine and leaned back in her chair, her face glowing with satisfaction. "This is it, Jake. This is your moment. You've shown them that loyalty to your community is more valuable than any corporate buyout. And the people of Willow Creek will never forget it." Jake thought about the long road that had led him here, the sleepless nights, the pressure, the doubts. It had all been worth it. He had stuck to his guns and had proven that it wasn't just about surviving in business. It was about thriving while staying true to the values that mattered most. As weeks turned into months, the success of Jake's restaurant continued to grow. Word spread beyond Willow Creek. Tourists started coming from neighboring towns, eager to experience the charm and authenticity of the restaurant and the festival. The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat, it was a symbol of the power of community, of what could happen when people work together for a common cause. Jake and Amanda continued to expand on their mission. They partnered with local farms to offer fresh, seasonal ingredients, creating a menu that showcased the best of Willow Creek's natural bounty. The festival, which had started as a one-time event, became an annual tradition, drawing larger crowds each year and strengthening the bonds between the town's residents and the restaurant. But Jake never lost sight of what had brought them here in the first place, the people. Every time he saw a familiar face in the restaurant, every time he overheard a conversation about how the community had come together to support his dream, he knew that this was the real victory. One afternoon, as Jake was sitting in the restaurant, a young couple approached him. They introduced themselves as new residents of Willow Creek, and they told him that they had visited the town specifically because of the reputation his restaurant had garnered. They praised the food, the ambience, and especially the sense of community that they felt when they walked in. They mentioned that they had heard the story of how the restaurant had fought off a corporate takeover, and it had inspired them to settle in Willow Creek. Jake smiled as he listened to them, his heart swelling with gratitude. He realized then that his story was no longer just his own. It had become a part of the town's history. It was about resilience, pride, and standing up for what you believe in, no matter the odds. The legacy of his restaurant had outgrown its walls and had become woven into the fabric of Willow Creek itself. As Jake looked around the bustling restaurant, the laughter of families and the clinking of glasses filled the air. He knew that the journey had been long, but it had been worth every challenge. They had built something real here. Something that wasn't just about food, but about people, about community, and about the unwavering belief that with hard work, passion, and loyalty, anything was possible. And so, as the sun began to set over Willow Creek, casting a warm golden light through the windows, Jake raised his glass, toasting to the future. To the restaurant. To the community. To the journey ahead. To us, he said softly. Amanda raised her glass to meet his. To the dream. The restaurant was more than just a place, it was a testament to everything they had fought for. It wasn't just about what they had built, it was about what they had become, together. And as long as they stayed true to their roots, Jake knew that the restaurant would continue to thrive, and the legacy of Willow Creek would live on for generations to come. The battle was over. The victory was theirs. And it was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?